The wind speaks a language of pure malice. It howls across the plains, a predator of ice and speed, stripping warmth from the world. For Sarah, its voice is a death sentence whispered against the thin canvas of her broken-down prairie schooner. Each gust threatens to tear the last of their shelter away, leaving her and her son exposed to the killing white of the blizzard. The world has shrunk to this rattling wagon, the failing light of a late afternoon, and the cold that has already stolen the feeling from her fingers and toes. Her son, 6-year-old Thomas, is a small, shivering bundle wrapped in every blanket they own, his face pale in the gloom. "Is Papa coming back soon, Mama?" His voice is a thin thread of sound, nearly snatched away by the gale. Sarah's heart cracks anew. It is a fresh wound, layered over the deep, abiding grief of the past 2 months since she buried her husband, Daniel. "Papa's with the angels now, sweet boy. Remember? We're going to find a new home. A safe place." The words are ash in her mouth. Safety is a distant country, and they are lost in a frozen hell. The wagon's axle snapped an hour ago, a crack as sharp and final as a rifle shot. She had tried to fix it, her hands raw and bleeding from the frozen iron, but it was hopeless. Now, their only choice is to wait for the storm to claim them or to walk into its teeth. She peers through a slit in the canvas, her eyes stinging from the wind-driven snow. Emptiness. A universe of swirling white, indifferent and vast. But then, through the maelstrom, she sees it. A flicker. A tiny, improbable spark of gold miles away, winking in and out of existence as the snow thickens and thins. A light. A cabin, maybe. A chance. Hope is a dangerous, cruel thing. It demands energy she doesn't have. Courage she fears has been frozen solid. But looking at Thomas, his small chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, she knows she has no choice. Desperation is a stronger fuel than hope. She unwraps her son, pulls his coat tighter, and tucks his head against her shoulder. "We're going for a little walk, my love," she whispers, her own breath pluming and freezing in the air. Stepping out of the wagon is like plunging into an icy river. The wind slams into her, a physical blow that steals her breath and drives needles of cold through her worn wool coat. She stumbles, finds her footing, and fixes her gaze on that distant, wavering light. It is her only compass in a world that has disappeared. Each step is a battle. The snow is knee-deep, a treacherous powder hiding a frozen, uneven ground. Her legs burn, her lungs ache, and the weight of her son feels immense. She talks to him, a constant stream of nonsense about warm fires and hot soup, her words torn from her lips and scattered by the wind. She doesn't know if he can hear her. She doesn't know if she's talking to him or to herself, a desperate prayer to keep moving. Time loses meaning. There is only the next step and the one after. The light doesn't seem to get any closer. It remains a taunting speck, a star fallen into a sea of snow. Twice, she falls, the impact jarring her to the bone. The second time, lying in the snow with Thomas a dead weight on top of her, she almost gives in. The cold is seductive now, a heavy blanket promising a final, dreamless sleep. It would be so easy to close her eyes. But Thomas stirs, a faint whimper against her neck, and the sound is a lash that drives her back to her feet. She staggers on, a ghost moving through a world of ghosts. Finally, impossibly, the light resolves itself. It is a window, a perfect, glowing square cut into the dark shape of a log cabin nestled in a shallow ravine, partially sheltered from the worst of the wind. Smoke whips from its stone chimney, a flag of life in the desolate landscape. Relief and terror war within her. Who lives in such a place, so far from any road or town? A trapper? A prospector? Or someone hiding from the world for a darker reason? The frontier is full of men who have put their pasts behind them, often for good reason. Approaching a stranger's door in the dead of night, in the middle of nowhere, is a gamble a woman alone should never take. But the alternative is the frozen ground. She has no other cards to play. She reaches the door, her last reserves of strength gone. Her knuckles are too numb to knock, so she bangs her fist against the rough-hewn wood, the sound dull and pathetic against the roar of the storm. For a long moment, there is nothing. She bangs again, harder, a desperate, frantic rhythm. The bolt scrapes from within, a loud, metallic sound that makes her flinch. The door cracks open a few inches. A man's face appears in the gap, framed by the warm lantern light from inside. He is not what she expected. He is younger than she thought he might be, perhaps 30, with a face that looks like it was carved from granite and left out in the sun and wind. A dark, untrimmed beard shadows a hard jaw, and his eyes, a startlingly pale gray, are narrowed with suspicion. In his hand, held low but ready, is a Colt revolver. He says nothing, simply watches her, his gaze taking in her snow-caked clothes, her chattering teeth, and the small, still form of her son in her arms. Sarah finds her voice, though it comes out as a ragged croak. "Please," she begs, the single word a summary of all her fear and desperation. "My son. He's so cold. Our wagon broke down. The storm, she can't finish." Sobs choke her. "Please. Just for the night. Hide us tonight." The man's stony expression does not change. His eyes flick from her face to the child, then out past her into the swirling vortex of snow, as if weighing her story against the truth of the blizzard. The silence stretches, filled only by the wind's scream. He is judging them, deciding their fate. She can see the hard refusal forming in his jaw, the impulse of a man who trusts no one to send them back into the night. But then his gaze settles back on Thomas, whose small, blue-tinged face is visible in the lantern light. A flicker of something unreadable passes through those gray eyes. A softening, so slight she might have imagined it. He gives a short, sharp nod, and with 3 words, his voice a low gravel, his life, and hers, were irrevocably changed. "Get inside. Now, danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe." He stepped back, pulling the heavy door wide enough for her to stumble past him into the cabin. The sudden warmth was a shock, a thick, welcome blanket of air that smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something savory, like stew. It was a single room, not large, but immaculately kept. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a healthy fire crackling within its hearth. A narrow bed was built into the opposite wall, covered with a thick buffalo hide. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and shelves lined with tins and sacks of flour and beans spoke of a man who planned for a long winter. It was the sparse, efficient home of a man who lived alone and expected no company. The man shut the door, the storm's roar instantly muffled to a low moan. He slid the heavy wooden bolt back into place, the sound echoing the finality of their entrance. They were sealed in. Sarah stood swaying, clutching Thomas, overwhelmed by the sudden transition from the howling, frozen abyss to this pocket of warmth and life. The man, Jedediah Stone, though she did not know his name, gestured with his chin toward the fire. "Put the boy down there, on the rug." His voice was still gruff, devoid of warmth, but it was a command for their comfort, not a threat. Sarah moved on numb legs, her body clumsy with cold. She gently laid Thomas on the thick bearskin rug before the hearth, his small body seeming lost in the dark fur. The man was already moving, ladling steaming stew from a pot hanging over the fire into a wooden bowl. He handed it to her, along with a tin spoon. "Eat," he ordered. It wasn't a suggestion. She took the bowl, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The stew was thick with meat and vegetables, and the warmth seeped into her fingers, a painful, prickling sensation as they began to thaw. She took a spoonful, the hot liquid a balm to her frozen insides. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. Jed watched her for a moment, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention to Thomas. He knelt by the boy, his large frame casting a long shadow in the firelight. Sarah tensed, a primal fear for her child rising in her throat. But he was surprisingly gentle. He carefully unwrapped the layers of wet blankets and peeled off Thomas's damp coat and boots. The boy was shivering violently now, his skin frighteningly pale. "He needs to get warm, fast," Jed said, his voice low. He disappeared for a moment into a shadowy corner of the cabin and returned with a heavy, dry wool blanket. He wrapped Thomas in it, tucking it snugly around his small body, before lifting him and placing him closer to the fire, but not so close as to be in danger. He then took Sarah's wet cloak without a word and hung it on a peg near the hearth to dry. These were not the actions of a monster. They were the practical, necessary gestures of a man accustomed to survival. He sat down in one of the chairs at the table, picking up his own bowl of stew and eating in silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the moan of the wind outside, and the scrape of their spoons against wood. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken questions. Sarah ate quickly, hunger and gnawing ache in her belly. She was acutely aware of the man watching her. He wasn't staring, but she could feel his periodic, assessing glances. He was a predator in his own den, and she and her son were the unexpected, unknown creatures who had stumbled into it. She was a widow, raised in the relative civility of St. Louis, taught the proper ways for a woman to behave. Nothing in her life had prepared her for this. Her husband, Daniel, had been a good man, a merchant with a kind heart and a booming laugh. His death from pneumonia had shattered her world. His family, who had always resented her for what they saw as her humble origins, had descended like vultures. Her brother-in-law, Marcus, a man with a cruel mouth and grasping hands, had made it clear he intended to have her declared an unfit mother, seize control of Daniel's estate, and take custody of Thomas. Fleeing was her only option. She had sold what little jewelry she had, packed the wagon with their most essential belongings, and slipped away in the night, heading west toward the promise of a new life in Oregon, a place where no one knew her name. She had made it as far as the Nebraska territories before the blizzard, and the broken axle had brought her to this desperate halt. The man across from her finished his stew and set the bowl down. "Where were you headed?" he asked, his voice breaking the quiet. "Oregon," she answered, her voice barely a whisper. He grunted, a sound of skepticism. "That's a damn fool journey for a woman alone with a child, especially this time of year." I had no choice. He didn't press her. He seemed to accept her answer as the only one that mattered. He rose and went to a small chest in the corner, pulling out another thick blanket. He brought it to her. "You can take the bed. I'll sit by the fire." Sarah stared at him, then at the narrow bed. It was his only bed. "I couldn't. We're grateful enough for the floor." "I wasn't asking," he said flatly. "The boy needs warmth. You're no good to him if you fall ill. Take the bed." There was no arguing with the cold logic in his voice. Exhaustion was a tide pulling her under, and the thought of a soft place to lie was overwhelmingly tempting. She nodded, murmuring her thanks. She checked on Thomas, who had stopped shivering and seemed to be sleeping, his breathing shallow but even. Then, feeling the man's gaze on her back, she laid down on the bed, not even bothering to remove her damp dress. She was too tired. She curled on her side, facing the wall, acutely aware of her vulnerability. She was sharing a small, locked room with a strange, armed man. Every instinct screamed that she should be terrified, and she was. But beneath the fear was a profound, bone-deep gratitude. He had saved them. Whatever else he was, tonight he was their savior. She fell asleep listening to the two sounds that now defined her world: the howl of the blizzard outside the walls, and the quiet, steady breathing of the man who sat guard by the fire. Jedediah Stone watched the woman and her child sleep. The firelight played across their faces, softening the lines of fear and exhaustion on hers, illuminating the innocent peace on the boys. He hadn't wanted to let them in. His entire existence for the past year had been predicated on one simple rule: trust no one. People were trouble. They brought questions, complications, and the law. His life in this remote cabin was a Spartan existence of solitude and vigilance. He hunted, he trapped, and he waited. He waited for the memory of his face to fade from the minds of the men who hunted him, chief among them A.U.S. Marshal named Elias Blackwood, a man with a reputation for being as relentless as a wolf on a blood trail. Seeing the woman at his door, her face a mask of desperate terror, had set every one of his alarms ringing. His first instinct had been to send her away. His life depended on his isolation. But then he had seen the boy, his small face blue with cold, his body limp in her arms. And in that moment, Jed hadn't seen a complication. He'd seen his younger sister, Clara, in the last weeks of her illness, her own face pale and her breathing shallow. He'd robbed that bank for her, a desperate, clumsy attempt to get the money for a doctor in Denver who claimed he could cure her. It had all gone wrong. The clerk had pulled a gun, shots were fired, and Jed had fled with the money, a wanted man. It hadn't even mattered. By the time he'd made it back with the cash, Clara was gone. and he was left with nothing but a saddlebag of useless dollars and a price on his head. He poked the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He was what the wanted posters said he was, a bank robber, an outlaw. He was not a good man. Good men didn't live like this, hiding from the world. But looking at the sleeping child, he knew he wasn't the kind of man who could have left him to die in the snow, either. That, he supposed, was the complication. He was trapped by the same flicker of decency that had gotten him into this mess in the first place. He settled into his chair for the night, the Colt resting on his thigh. He would let them stay until the blizzard broke. Then they would have to leave. He would give them food, point them toward the nearest town, and send them on their way. He could not afford the risk they represented. He could not afford to care. He stared into the flames, forcing the memory of his sister's face away, and listened to the storm rage on. The next morning, the world was silent. The wind had died, leaving behind a landscape transformed, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The silence was what woke Sarah. It was so complete, so absolute. It felt unnatural after the ceaseless roar of the storm. She sat up, disoriented for a moment, the coarse wool blanket scratching her chin. The cabin was dim, the light from the single window filtered and soft. The fire had been banked to glowing embers, but the room was still warm. Thomas was still asleep on the rug, a small mound under the heavy blanket. And the man, Jed, was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Had he left them? Locked them in? She scrambled off the bed, her heart pounding. She rushed to the door and found it unbolted. Pushing it open, she was met with a wall of snow that reached halfway up the doorframe. A narrow path had been shoveled from the doorway out into the white expanse. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the sun on the snow was blinding. Of Jed, there was no sign. But then she saw him. He was a dark figure moving near the tree line at the edge of the ravine, his rifle over his shoulder. He was checking a line of traps. Relief washed over her, so potent it left her weak in the knees. He hadn't abandoned them. She turned back inside and saw a pot of coffee on the hearth, kept warm by the embers. Beside it were 2 tins of peaches and a hard biscuit for each of them. It was a simple, thoughtful provision. She stoked the fire, adding a few small logs from the neat pile beside the hearth, and soon had it crackling again. Thomas began to stir, his eyes fluttering open. He sat up, looking around the strange room with a child's open curiosity, his fear from the night before seemingly forgotten. "Mama, where are we?" "We're safe, my love," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "A kind man gave us shelter from the storm." She helped him up and gave him his breakfast. He ate hungrily, his color much better than the day before. The warmth and rest had worked their magic. By the time Jed returned, stamping the snow from his boots at the doorway, Sarah had tidied the cabin as best she could, folding the blankets and sweeping the floor with a crude broom she found in the corner. It was a small gesture, her only way of repaying his kindness. He entered, a brace of rabbits hanging from his belt. He nodded a curt greeting, his pale eyes taking in her work without comment. He set about skinning the rabbits with an efficient, practiced ease that was both fascinating and unsettling to watch. He moved with a quiet confidence, a man perfectly at home in his harsh environment. "The snow is deep," he said, not looking at her. "Drifts are over 10 feet in places. No one's going anywhere for at least a few days." Sarah's heart sank. A few days, trapped here, with him. The thought was both a comfort and a terror. They were safe from the elements, but the longer they stayed, the more of a burden they became, and the greater the risk to him, and perhaps to them. "We have some food in the wagon," she offered. "If I could get to it." "Your wagon's a mile from here and likely buried to its roof," he cut in, his tone flat. "I have enough. We won't starve." The conversation was over. He made it clear that he was in charge of their survival, and she was to accept it. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. The cabin was their entire world, a small wooden island in a vast white sea. Jed was a man of few words. He spent his time oiling his rifle, mending his gear, or staring into the fire, lost in thoughts he never shared. He was a constant, intimidating presence, yet he never made her feel threatened. He treated her with a distant, formal courtesy. He gave her and Thomas the bed each night without argument, sleeping in his chair by the fire. He made sure they ate first at every meal. Sarah, in turn, tried to make herself useful. She cooked their meals from his stores, her skills with the limited ingredients surprising even herself. She mended his worn shirt with a small sewing kit from her reticule, her stitches neat and even. She kept the cabin clean and tidy. They were small, domestic acts, but in the close confines of the cabin, they felt significant, a way of creating order and normalcy in a precarious situation. They were building a temporary home, a fragile truce against the wilderness outside and the unspoken tensions within. The true bridge between them was Thomas. Unburdened by adult fears and suspicions, he was simply fascinated by Jed. He would watch, wide-eyed, as Jed sharpened his knife or carved a piece of wood. After 2 days of silent observation, Thomas finally got up the courage to approach him. "What are you making?" he asked, his small voice clear in the quiet room. Jed looked up from the piece of pine he was whittling. He seemed surprised to be addressed directly. He looked at the wood in his hands, then back at the boy. "A bird," he said, his voice softer than Sarah had ever heard it. "Can I see?" Thomas pressed, inching closer. Jed hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. He held out the half-finished carving. It was rough, but the shape of a hawk, wings outstretched, was already emerging from the wood. Thomas looked at it with reverence. For the rest of the afternoon, he sat on the floor by Jed's chair, watching in rapt silence. By evening, Jed had finished. He smoothed the last rough edge with his thumb and handed the small wooden hawk to Thomas. "Here," he said. Thomas took it, his eyes shining. "Thank you," he breathed. He clutched the bird to his chest as if it were the greatest treasure in the world. From that moment on, the boy was Jed's shadow. A fragile, tentative bond was forming between the silent, haunted man and the curious, innocent child. Sarah watched them, her heart a confusing mix of gratitude and apprehension. This man was kind to her son. He was their protector. But she could not forget the way his hand always rested near the butt of his pistol, or the way his eyes constantly scanned the white emptiness outside the window. He was a man expecting trouble, and she couldn't shake the feeling that by sheltering them, he was inviting it into his home. On the 4th day, the incident happened. Sarah was sorting through one of Jed's saddlebags, looking for a piece of leather to patch Thomas's worn boot, something Jed had given her permission to do. Tucked in a side pocket, wrapped in oilcloth, was a stack of papers. Her fingers brushed against them, and one fell open. It was a wanted poster. The paper was creased and weathered, but the sketch was unmistakable. It was Jed. The drawing was stark, capturing the hardness of his jaw and the intensity of his eyes. Beneath it, the words were starker still. Jedediah Stone, wanted for bank robbery and murder of a bank teller. $500 reward. The breath left her body in a rush. Murder. The word screamed up at her from the page. She felt a wave of dizziness, her hand flying to her mouth. The man who had saved her, who had been so gentle with her son, was a killer. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thick, suffocating. The safety she had begun to feel was a lie, a dangerous illusion. She quickly shoved the poster back into the bag, her hands trembling. But it was too late. When she looked up, Jed was standing in the doorway, his face a cold, hard mask. He had seen her. He knew what she had found. The silence that fell was absolute, a crushing weight that pressed down on Sarah. The crackle of the fire sounded like thunder in the stillness. Jed's gray eyes were fixed on her, and all the quiet kindness she had glimpsed in him over the past few days was gone, replaced by the glacial hardness she had seen that first night. He knew that she knew. The fragile trust they had begun to build lay shattered between them. He walked slowly to the table and sat down, his movements deliberate. He didn't speak, just waited, his gaze never leaving her face. He was leaving the next move to her. Her mind raced. She should be screaming. She should be grabbing Thomas and running out into the snow, taking her chances with the cold rather than staying another second with a murderer. But her feet felt rooted to the floor. She thought of him wrapping a warm blanket around her shivering son, of the gently carved hawk he had placed in Thomas's hand, of the way he made sure they ate before he did. How could that man be the same one described on that poster? "It's true, then?" she finally managed to ask, her voice a strained whisper. He didn't flinch. "Some of it," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I robbed the bank. I didn't kill anyone. The teller shot first. His own bullet ricocheted and hit him. But no one was going to listen to my side of it." He delivered the words with a flat finality, offering no further defense, asking for no belief. He was simply stating his truth. Sarah stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was a woman who had always believed in the clear lines between right and wrong, good and evil. But here, in this isolated cabin, those lines were blurred and indistinct. He had broken the law, a serious crime, but he had also saved her life and the life of her child. "You should have left us in the snow," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "You took a great risk, letting us in." "I know what I did," he replied, his eyes unblinking. "The question is, what are you going to do? The snow's melting. The pass might be clear in a day or two. You could make it to town. Tell the sheriff where I am. That $500 would go a long way for a widow starting a new life." He was testing her, laying the choice bare. Her fear against his life. Her future against his. The cold, practical part of her brain acknowledged the truth in his words. $500 was a fortune. It would guarantee their safe passage to Oregon and a comfortable start when they got there. It was the sensible choice, the safe choice. But as she looked at him, sitting there so still, accepting her judgment before she had even passed it, she saw not a monster, but a man trapped by his past, a man who had made a terrible mistake and was now paying the price. And he was a man who, when faced with a woman and child freezing to death on his doorstep, had chosen compassion over his own safety. She thought of her brother-in-law, Marcus, a man who moved within the highest circles of St. Louis society, a man who was respected and obeyed, a man who followed every letter of the law. And yet, he was trying to steal her son and her home with a cruelty that was far more monstrous than anything she had seen in Jedediah Stone. "I am not a bounty hunter," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You saved us. That is the only truth that matters to me in this room." A flicker of something, surprise, relief, passed through his guarded eyes, so quick she almost missed it. He gave a single, sharp nod. The tension in the room did not disappear, but it changed. The line of judgment had been drawn and crossed. She had made her choice. She had sided with the outlaw. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer the silence of suspicion, but the silence of a shared, dangerous secret. They were allies now, bound together not just by the storm, but by the wanted poster hidden in his saddlebag. That night, a new understanding settled between them. The polite distance was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful intimacy. They spoke more than they had in all the previous days combined. He didn't talk more about the robbery, and she didn't ask. Instead, he told her about growing up in the mountains of Colorado, about his sister Clara and her laugh that sounded like wind chimes. He spoke of her with a deep, aching sadness that resonated with Sarah's own fresh grief for Daniel. In turn, she told him about her life in St. Louis, about Daniel's kindness and the plans they had made together. And she told him about Marcus, about the threats and the legal papers she carried in a waterproof pouch, documents that proved her sole guardianship of Thomas and her inheritance of Daniel's estate. "He thinks because I am a woman, I am weak," she said, her voice laced with a bitter fire. "He thinks he can bully me into submission." Jed listened, his expression grim. Men like that, men who hide behind money and lawyers, are often the worst kind of cowards, he said. They use rules and laws like a club, but they have no stomach for a real fight. As they talked, Sarah realized that the fear she'd felt upon discovering his secret had faded, replaced by a growing respect. He was a man who lived by his own code, a harsh and unforgiving one, perhaps, but a code nonetheless. He had faced his mistakes head-on, accepting the consequences, even if it meant a life in hiding. He had a strength and an integrity that her respectable, law-abiding brother-in-law utterly lacked. The next day brought a significant change. A break in the clouds allowed a pale sun to shine through, and the slow process of melting began. The world outside the cabin started to reappear from under its white blanket. The change brought with it a renewed sense of urgency. Their time in this strange sanctuary was coming to an end. Soon, the trails would be passable. Soon, they would have to leave. The thought filled Sarah with a surprising pang of regret. This small cabin had become a haven, and the company of this quiet, dangerous man had become a strange sort of comfort. Jed seemed to feel the shift as well. He grew more restless, his gaze returning again and again to the horizon, scanning for any sign of movement. The danger he had been hiding from felt closer now, more real. One afternoon, as he stood by the window, he suddenly stiffened. "Get the boy," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Get in the root cellar. Now. Don't make a sound." Sarah's blood ran cold. She didn't question him. She grabbed a sleeping Thomas from the bed and hurried to the corner of the cabin where a heavy trapdoor was set into the floorboards. Jed heaved it open, revealing a dark, earthy-smelling hole. "Go," he hissed. She scrambled down the short ladder into the cramped, dark space, clutching Thomas tightly. Jed handed down a blanket and a canteen of water before pulling the door shut over their heads, plunging them into near-total darkness. A thin sliver of light from between the floorboards was their only illumination. Above them, she could hear Jed moving, kicking dirt over the edges of the trapdoor, dragging the heavy bearskin rug to cover it. Then, silence. Thomas stirred in her arms. "Mama, it's dark," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Show my love," she soothed, her own heart pounding. "It's a game. We have to be very, very quiet." They waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The cellar was cold and damp, and the earthy smell was overpowering. Sarah held her breath, straining to hear something, anything, from the world above. Finally, she heard it, the crunch of boots in the snow, then a sharp rap on the cabin door. Her heart leaped into her throat. "Hello, the cabin," a voice called out, deep and authoritative. "U.S. Marshal. Anyone in there?" Marshal. The word was a death knell. This was the man Jed feared. This was Marshal Blackwood. Sarah pressed her face against Thomas's hair, praying the boy wouldn't make a sound. She heard Jed's boots cross the floor, the scrape of the bolt being drawn. "What do you want?" Jed's voice was rough, unwelcoming. "Marshal Elias Blackwood," the man said. "Just checking these remote homesteads. Big storm. Making sure no one's in trouble. You alone out here?" "I am," Jed said. The lie was smooth, utterly convincing. "Mind if I warm myself by your fire for a moment? Been riding since dawn." There was a pause. Sarah could picture the scene in her mind. Jed in the doorway, blocking the marshal's view, every muscle tense. To refuse would be suspicious. To agree was to invite the wolf into the den. "Suit yourself," Jed finally said, his voice grudging. The floorboards above them creaked as a second man entered the cabin. Sarah held Thomas so tightly he squirmed in her arms. She could hear the murmur of voices, the clink of a coffee cup. The marshal was asking questions about the area, about how long Jed had been there. Jed's answers were short, clipped, revealing nothing. He was playing the part of a surly, antisocial trapper to perfection. "Seen anyone pass this way in the last week?" the marshal asked. "A woman and a child, maybe? In a prairie schooner?" Sarah's breath hitched. They were looking for her. Marcus had sent the law after her, painting her as a hysterical, kidnapping mother. "Just snow," Jed replied, his voice flat. "Nothing but snow and wind for days." The conversation continued for what felt like hours. The marshal was thorough, persistent. He spoke of the man he was tracking, a bank robber named Stone. "Killed a man in cold blood," the marshal said, his voice hard. "He's dangerous. Thought he might have headed for these mountains. You see anyone fitting his description, you send word to Fort Laramie." "I'll do that," Jed said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Finally, the floorboards creaked again. "Well, thanks for the coffee," the marshal said. "You take care out here." "You too," Jed replied. She heard the door close, the bolt slide home. But they didn't move. They waited in the suffocating darkness, listening. It could be a trick. The marshal could be waiting outside, watching the cabin. They stayed in the cellar for another hour, in complete silence, until Jed finally lifted the trapdoor. Light flooded the small space. Jed's face, looking down at them, was pale and grim. "He's gone," he said. He reached down to help her out. When she was back in the main room, her legs shaking, she looked at him. The close call had left its mark on both of them. The danger was no longer a distant threat. It had knocked on their door. And Jed had lied for them. He had shielded them, putting his own life on the line. "He was looking for me, too," she whispered, the realization hitting her with its full force. "My brother-in-law must have reported me as missing, or worse." Jed nodded, his jaw tight. "It seems we're both running from the law, in our own way." The shared danger was a powerful bond, stronger than any words. In that dark, cold cellar, A profound shift had occurred. She was no longer just a victim he was sheltering out of pity. They were partners in a desperate gamble. Her pursuers and his were now intertwined threats. That night, as she lay in the narrow bed, she did not face the wall. She lay on her back, staring into the darkness, listening to his steady breathing by the fire. She felt a fierce, terrifying protectiveness toward him. She realized, with a jolt that had nothing to do with the cold, that she was no longer thinking about just surviving. She was thinking about them surviving. The thought of leaving, of heading on to Oregon alone, now felt like an amputation. The outlaw who had reluctantly given them shelter had become inextricably woven into the fabric of her life. The fear of losing this fragile sanctuary, this unexpected connection, was now a greater fear than any she had faced in the storm. The blizzard had broken their wagon, but it seemed to have broken something open inside of her, too, leaving her vulnerable to a feeling she had thought was buried forever with Daniel, a deep, burgeoning affection for the man sitting guard in the darkness. The passing of Marshall Blackwood acted as a catalyst. The fragile peace of their isolation was shattered. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. They both knew they couldn't stay. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a trap waiting to be sprung. "You have to go," Jed said the next morning, his voice rough with a sleepless night. "Both of you." As soon as the sun is up, he wouldn't meet her eyes, focusing instead on cleaning his rifle with furious, jerky movements. "I'll pack you enough food for a week. The town, Cottonwood Creek, is 2 days' ride south. You can find help there. Get a stagecoach." Sarah watched him, her heart sinking. He was pushing them away, severing the bond that had grown between them. It was the logical thing to do. His survival depended on being alone. Her presence, and the fact that the law was now looking for her as well, put him in double the jeopardy. But logic had little to do with the turmoil in her chest. "And you?" she asked quietly. "What will you do?" "I'll head north," he said, still not looking at her. "Deeper into the mountains. Disappear for a while." Disappear. The word was so final. The thought of him alone in the high country, hunted and haunted, was unbearable. She thought of the journey ahead of her, of facing the world alone with Thomas, and a cold dread washed over her. She had been alone since Daniel died, but she hadn't truly felt it until this moment, faced with the prospect of leaving this man. "No," she said. The word was soft, but it stopped his hands. He slowly looked up, his gray eyes finally meeting hers. "No," he repeated, a frown creasing his brow. "I won't leave you," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Not like this. We're in this together now. Your risk is my risk." He stared at her, a complex mix of disbelief and something else, something softer, more vulnerable, in his expression. "You don't know what you're saying," he said, his voice low. "I'm a wanted man. Sticking with me is a death sentence. For you and the boy. And what kind of life awaits us in Cottonwood Creek?" she countered, stepping closer. "My brother-in-law will have sent word everywhere. They'll see a lone widow with a child, and they'll send a telegram back to St. Louis before I can even buy a stagecoach ticket. They'll take Thomas from me, Jed. I know they will. With you. At least we have a chance." "A chance at what?" he scoffed, a bitter edge to his voice. "A life on the run? Hiding in shadows? That's no life for a child." "It's better than no life at all," she insisted. "And better than a life in a cage, which is what Marcus is offering my son." They stood there, locked in a battle of wills. He was trying to protect her by sending her away, and she was trying to protect him by staying. Suddenly, a sound from outside cut through the tension, a distant shout, carried on the wind. Jed was at the window in an instant, his body rigid. He peered through the glass, his hand already on his gun. "Riders," he said, his voice a grim whisper. "A posse, coming up the ravine. They've found the wagon. They're following your tracks in the snow." Panic flared in Sarah's chest, hot and suffocating. It was over. Marcus had found her. "The cellar," she gasped, moving toward the trapdoor. "No," Jed said, grabbing her arm. "Too late. They'd find us in minutes. They'll search the place top to bottom." He was thinking fast, his mind racing. "There's only one way. I create a diversion. Lead them off. I'll head north, draw them after me. It'll give you time to slip away south." It was a suicide mission. A posse against one man. They would run him to ground and kill him. She saw the grim acceptance in his eyes. He was willing to sacrifice himself for them. And in that moment, all her fear coalesced into a fierce, unshakable resolve. "No," she said again, her voice ringing with authority. She pulled the waterproof pouch of legal documents from inside her dress. "We are done running. We are done hiding." She met his astonished gaze, her own eyes blazing. "Your friend Marshall Blackwood said he was a man of the law. Let's see if that's true. Men like my brother-in-law, they are bullies who thrive on fear. We are not going to be afraid anymore." Jed stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Sarah, they have guns. They won't stop to read your paperwork. They will if they're faced with a woman who isn't running," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And who has a man standing beside her who looks like he knows how to use that gun he's holding. We will not hide in the cellar. We will meet them at the door. Together." Her courage was a tangible thing, a force that seemed to fill the small cabin. Jed looked from her determined face to the legal papers in her hand, then out the window at the approaching riders. He saw the logic in her madness. Running was what a guilty person did. Hiding was an admission of weakness. Facing them down, it was an insane gamble, but it was the only one they had left that didn't end with one of them dead or captured. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile. "All right, Mrs. Hale," he said, his voice a low drawl. "We'll do it your way." He checked the loads in his Colt, his movements calm and sure. He was no longer a man running from his past. He was a man making a stand for his future. He handed her a second pistol, a smaller Derringer, from his weapon's chest. "You know how to use this?" She looked at the small, deadly weapon in her palm. "Daniel taught me. I never thought I'd have to. Just point and pull the trigger," he said. "Don't aim to kill. Aim to make them think twice. Let me do the talking, at first." She nodded, tucking the pistol into the pocket of her dress, her hand closing around its cool, metal grip. They stood side by side, waiting. The sound of the posse grew louder, the crunch of snow, the jingle of harnesses, the low murmur of men's voices. They stopped just outside the cabin. "Sarah, I know you're in there," a man's voice bellowed. It was Marcus. His voice was just as she remembered it, arrogant, entitled, and grating. "Come out now? This foolishness is over." Jed glanced at her, one last questioning look. She met his gaze and nodded, her resolve firm. Together, he took a deep breath, unbolted the door, and pulled it open. The morning sun was bright, glinting off the snow and the barrels of the half-dozen rifles pointed at the cabin. Marcus sat on a fine-looking bay horse at the front of the group, his face smug and triumphant. He was a portly man, dressed in an expensive city coat that looked ridiculous in the rugged wilderness. The men with him were hard-faced and hired, their eyes cold and mercenary. Marcus's smug expression faltered when he saw Jed standing in the doorway, tall and implacable, the Colt held loosely but ready at his side. He had clearly expected to find a hysterical woman, not a formidable, armed man. "Who in the hell are you?" Marcus demanded, his bravado strained. "I'm the man who owns this cabin," Jed said, his voice calm and cold as a river stone. "And you're trespassing." Before Marcus could respond, Sarah stepped out from behind Jed, moving to stand beside him. She held her head high, her gaze fixed on her brother-in-law. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You've come a long way to harass a grieving widow." Marcus's face contorted with fury. "Harass you? I've come to save you. To save my nephew from this vagrant you've taken up with. You are clearly unwell, Sarah. Hysterical. You'll come back with us now, and we can forget any of this happened." "I am not unwell, and I am not going anywhere," Sarah stated, her voice ringing in the crisp morning air. She held up the leather pouch. "I have here the last will and testament of my husband, Daniel Hale, witnessed and notarized in the city of St. Louis. It names me as his sole heir and the sole legal guardian of our son, Thomas. These men you've hired are witnesses to you attempting to abduct my son and myself against my will, which is a crime." A murmur went through the hired men. They had been paid to retrieve a runaway woman, not to get involved in a legal battle with kidnapping charges. They shifted uncomfortably, their rifles not looking quite so steady. Marcus's face turned a blotchy red. "That's preposterous. You're an unfit mother, running off into the wilderness with a wanted man." He pointed a shaking finger at Jed. "I know who you are. We met a marshal on the trail. He's hunting for a man named Stone. A murderer. You've fallen in with a killer, Sarah. This was it. The final card. Sarah's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. Jed didn't even flinch. The lady is under my protection, Jed said, his voice dangerously quiet. And this is my land. I'm telling you for the last time to get off it. Or what? Marcus sneered, his confidence returning. You'll shoot us all. There are 6 of us. He turned to his men. Take them. I'll double your pay. The hired guns hesitated, looking from Marcus's desperate face to Jed's cold, steady one. They were weighing the promise of more money against the certainty of a gunfight. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the standoff, sharp and clear. That's enough. Everyone turned. Riding up the trail behind the posse, alone, was Marshal Elias Blackwood. He sat his horse easily, his gaze sweeping over the scene, taking in the armed men, Sarah and Jed at the cabin door, and Marcus's enraged face. His expression was grim. Marshal, Marcus cried, his voice full of relief. Thank God. Arrest this man. He's Jedediah Stone, a wanted murderer. Marshal Blackwood dismounted slowly, his eyes never leaving Jed. I know who he is, he said quietly. He walked forward, stopping between the 2 groups. He looked at Sarah. Ma'am, this man is telling me you're being held against your will. He is lying, Marshal, Sarah said, her voice trembling but resolute. This man, Mr. Stone, saved my son and me from the blizzard. My brother-in-law, Marcus Hale, is trying to abduct my child to steal his inheritance. I have the legal papers to prove it. She held out the pouch to him. Blackwood took the pouch and opened it. He pulled out the documents, his eyes scanning the pages. He was a man who knew the law, and he recognized the authenticity of the seals and signatures. He read for a long moment, the only sound the wind whispering through the pines. Finally, he looked up, his gaze hard as iron. He looked at Marcus. According to this, the lady is well within her rights, Blackwood said, his voice flat. This is a civil matter. If you have a dispute, you can take it to a circuit judge. What you're doing here, with armed men, looks a whole lot like coercion. I'd advise you and your men to ride out of here before I decide to arrest you for it. Marcus stared, his mouth agape. But what about him? He sputtered, pointing at Jed. He's a wanted man. The poster. $500. Marshal Blackwood slowly turned his gaze to Jed. The air was thick with tension. Jed stood his ground, his hand still resting on his Colt, his face a mask of stone. He was ready for the end, one way or another. The marshal looked from Jed's defiant face to Sarah, standing steadfastly by his side. He saw the way the boy, Thomas, had come to the doorway and was now clinging to Jed's leg, looking not at his uncle, but at the marshal with fearful eyes. Blackwood was a man of the law, but he was also a man of the West. He had seen true evil, and he had seen men make mistakes. He had been hunting a ghost for a year, a killer named Stone. But all he saw here was a man protecting a family. He saw a woman who had found her courage, and a child who had found a protector. He reached into his coat and pulled out the worn, folded wanted poster for Jedediah Stone. He held it up for all to see. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he tore it in half, and then in half again. He let the pieces flutter from his fingers onto the snow. I was hunting a bank robber, Marshal Blackwood said, his voice carrying in the silent air. But it seems I've been chasing a ghost. All I see here is a man protecting his family on his own land. He looked directly at Jed. The man I was looking for is gone. Make sure he doesn't come back. Behave yourself, son. He turned without another word, mounted his horse, and tipped his hat to Sarah. Ma'am. Then he rode away down the ravine, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Marcus and his men stared, dumbfounded. Their authority, their justification, had been literally torn to pieces and scattered on the snow. The hired guns, seeing their payday and any legal standing disappear, began to back away, lowering their rifles. They wanted no part of this anymore. Defeated and humiliated, Marcus shot one last look of pure hatred at Sarah and Jed, then viciously yanked his horse's reins and galloped away, his men trailing sheepishly behind him. And then, they were gone. The threat that had pursued them both, from St. Louis and from a botched robbery a year ago, had vanished. Silence descended upon the small cabin, broken only by the sound of the wind. Jed slowly, almost reluctantly, lowered his hand from his pistol. He looked at Sarah, his gray eyes filled with a raw, staggering emotion she couldn't name. Relief, disbelief, gratitude. The weight of his past had been lifted in a single, unexpected act of mercy. He was no longer Jedediah Stone, outlaw. He was just Jed. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes, not of fear or sadness, but of profound, overwhelming relief. It was over. They were safe. They were free. She reached out and took his hand. His fingers, calloused and strong, closed around hers. The touch was an anchor in a world that had suddenly righted itself. Thomas, who had been hiding behind Jed's legs, ran forward and wrapped his small arms around Jed's waist in a fierce hug. Jed looked down at the boy, then at Sarah, his Adam's apple bobbing as he swallowed hard. He placed his other hand on top of Thomas's head, a gesture of gentle possession, of protection freely given and accepted. He looked out at the vast, snow-covered landscape stretching before them. The sun was climbing higher, its light brilliant on the pristine snow. The wilderness that had almost claimed them, that had been their prison and their sanctuary, now looked different. It looked like a promise, a new beginning. The cabin, which had been a temporary, desperate shelter, suddenly felt like the foundation of a home. The blizzard had stranded a widow and her son at his door, but in truth, it had led them all home. He squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had survived and everything they were about to begin, together. The past was gone, scattered like pieces of paper in the snow. All that mattered was right here, in the warmth of the morning sun. This story shows love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more.